is we've got to tackle these wooden areas, because if we don't take them apart, they'll find their own way apart in the next few years. So we thought the first thing to do is tail fins. So what's the plan? A Lancaster is a sectional aircraft. So as you can see here, if you can decipher this plan, this is out of the AP 2062, which is basically the Bible on Lancasters. It's the manual for working on a Lancaster. It tells you everything about it. So you see a Lancaster is a sectional aircraft, so it's built in sections, brought together, bolted together and flown. So it has major sections: the cockpit, the centre section, the mid-section, the tail section, bomb doors, tail fin, rudder, elevator, tailplane, and then the plan view of the other. The trailing edges come off separate, the wingtip. And then you have the engine bearers and subframes, and the engine nacelles. So we thought, working from this, we'll break the aircraft down into major sections and work on a section at a time. The biggest problem we have here at East Kirkby is, to pay for the restoration, we have to taxi the aircraft. So we have 6 months of taxiing, raising funds, 6 months of actually doing the work. So everything has to be taken down to bite-sized pieces to actually eventually end up with a completely restored aircraft. That posed quite a head scratcher to the CAA, because they're used to an aircraft coming offline, being taken apart, restored, put together again and flown and finished. Whereas we've turned around and said to them, oh no, we don't want to do it like that. That's too easy. What we want to do is we want to take a bit off, restore it, put it back on. And they said, well, you're taking a bit off, making it airworthy, and as soon as you bolt it back on a non-airworthy aircraft, it's no longer airworthy. So there's been quite a head scratch as to how we're actually going to do the paperwork around doing the job this way. We've come up with a way of doing it, and in fact we've got another CAA inspection at the end of this month, inspecting the site and the work that we're doing. But at the moment, people seem happy with how it's progressing and how we're actually going to do it. The way that we've decided we're going to do this work, with doing it sectionally each winter, means that everything comes together by year, the final year, which I'll talk about in a minute, and everything is effectively, when it's off the aircraft, it's airworthy. When it's put on, it's not. But everything will then be airworthy by the final year. And the way that, with the CAA's agreement here, what we're going to do is in the final year, we'll actually do like the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster do, which is a major overhaul. And so with that, everything is inspected and signed off. So we will take the item off, say the fin, take the item off, bust it down, restore it, put it back together again, put it on the aircraft with all of the current paperwork all signed off. Then what we'll do is in the final year is we open it up with the inspection panels, look at it and say, yes, it's still airworthy, we'll sign it off. And then that final document is the airworthiness of the aircraft. So we've made the plan as to what year we're going to do what section. So year 0 was the paint strip and survey. That's the basis of the work going ahead. Year 1, which was last year, was the starboard tail fin and rudder, so on the starboard side of the aircraft. Starboard undercarriage to come off, and the undercarriage support beams to be NDT'd and checked. The undercarriage support beams are really large cast items or forged items, and they hold the undercarriage. They also are the pickup points for the engines, and they bolt back to the main spar. So they're kind of integral to the strength of the aircraft itself. So starboard side, year 1, they came off, were NDT'd and gone back on as airworthy items, or sufficient for airworthy. The subframe for the engine bearers and the bulkhead to come off for inspection. And then the removal of the starboard trailing edge. So the trailing edge basically bolts onto the back of the wing. It's this section here. So removal of that to inspect the web of the rear spar. So the first 2 years, and we're in year 2 now, are basically identical except for on opposite sides of the aircraft. So what we've learned from doing the starboard side and the parts we've had to produce for that, we've then also been able to produce for the port side, ready for the work on the port side, which is currently undergoing. Although it's all in a box at the moment, so you can't really see it. So year 3 is rear fuselage. So we're looking at transportation joint where the H2S is, so the blister underneath the aircraft, that point rearwards. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to jack the aircraft up. So the centre section, the main wing section is jacked up. The rear section is then craned up onto a high trestle, and a trestle is put in just forward of the H2S, and then the rear fuselage section is pulled away on wheels and lowered down. What we found with this aircraft, which is probably the biggest job, is the fact that it was built with mag alloy rivets. So the mag alloy rivet tends to degrade over a period of time. So we've decided that what we're going to do is replace every rivet on the aircraft with hydrominium modern rivets. That's going to mean that the life of this aircraft is going to extend exponentially. It's going to be good for decades to come. We thought we'd do the job once and do it now rather than having to come back in 20 years' time and do it again. So the biggest job, of course, other than bringing the aircraft part onto a jig to make sure it doesn't move, is to drill out all of the rivets and place new rivets in. The top of the rear fuselage has extremely long skins. I think they're about 15 feet, 11 to 15 feet, the skins on the top. So we're going to try and keep as many of those as we can, because actually getting aluminium now in sheet aluminium of that sort of length is quite tricky. And then the skins on the sides are slightly shorter, and they're all done in thin sections. So we can't do one skin at the front and then move on. It's basically a skin that travels the majority of the length of the fuselage. So we're going to have to kind of work as we go along. We'll take a skin off. The main reason for taking the skins off is to check the area between the skin and the former within the aircraft, so that it forms the shape and the stringers, to make sure there's no corrosion between the two faces. What you generally find between two faces that join is you get moisture trapped between the two, and then it forms corrosion, so you get a white powder that forms between the two faces, and that is corrosion. It's a bit like rust on steel, but it's on aluminium. So we've got to take all the skins off, check all the structure, make sure it's okay, then rivet either the original skins back on if they're okay, or new skins on where the skins are no longer usable, and replacing all those rivets. There was a Canadian advert during the Second World War saying there's 1 million rivets in a Lancaster. So if you give me 10 years, I'll let you know. So once the rear section is done, bolted back on, ready for taxiing in the May, and we go to year 4, which is the centre, the mid-section, if you like, which is where the roundel and all the letters are on the aircraft. Very similar process to the rear section. Of course, the mid-upper turret's within that section. And what you'll eventually find if you come each year is the aircraft will progress further forwards, and we'll be dotting around the aircraft each year, restoring different sections. Year 5 is quite a big year. So this is the very nose section, the bomb aimer section. So that's where the bomb aimer kneels down, leans forward, and that's basically bolted onto the cockpit of the aircraft. So that's going to be coming off and being worked on. Same process all the way through. The wingtips will also come off, trailing edges will come off. What we found in the trailing edges, like the one over there, that's the inner trailing edge off the port side, is the extrusion, so the angled sections on the trailing edges are quite corroded. So there's something called dissimilar corrosion on, particularly on this Lancaster, where steel meets aluminium, and they react with each other, and they cause you corrosion on the aircraft. So on the extrusion here, there's a section of it where it's been mated with steel, which has corroded, so that's no good for airworthy. So as time goes on, we've had to found an extrusion company. Extrusion is basically forcing metal through a die to make a particular shape. So we've got extrusions to make for the port tail fin, extrusions to make for the trailing edges, and also some stringers to make for the fuselage. So a lot of work at the moment that we're putting in is actually making those contacts, finding those people that can do the work, who are very few and far between. So 3 hours now will actually save time in the future, because we just ring them up and say we need more of whatever extrusion. So it's quite a slow process now, but actually speed up as we go along. So the trailing edges need quite a bit of work for extrusion replacement. The wingtips, where it meets the wing itself, is another piece of extrusion, and the bottom extrusion on those wingtips needs replacing as well. So we've got to find or have a die made for that angle of extrusion, have it all bent and rolled to the right size. So there's quite a lot of work in the trailing edges and the wingtips. But one thing we've found, which is a glorious piece of news, is that the rivets used in the trailing edges weren't mag alloy. It's about the only part of the aircraft that wasn't. Why they did, I don't know. So they possibly won't need completely re-riveting, but we have got to take the structure apart inside, clean it down, check it, and put it back together again. Okay, year 6 is a huge job, and that's the cockpit. There's loads of wires, connections, hydraulics, pneumatics, all in the cockpit area. The control panel is a huge job on its own. So the top of the canopy there, the front section is metal, the rear section is wood. That's all laminated wood. And of course, laminated wood over time delaminates. So we've got the wood to replace at the rear of the cockpit there. So that will be done. We'll have it made before the year actually comes to actually replacing it. Yeah, but the cockpit's a huge job, particularly when you look up in the bomb bay of the aircraft and see all the different faces that currently have paint on them, and have got to be paint stripped, inspected and repainted. So I shall be at the back of the queue when it comes to finding out who's going to be paint stripping the bomb bay. Year 7, tailplane and elevator. Tailplane has a spar in it, or 2 spars in it in fact, and they are limited to a certain number of hours. And of course any corrosion or any problems you find with them may dictate that the spars themselves have to be replaced. What we found within the tailplane as well is when the aircraft was stood at RAF Scampton, the control locks weren't in all the time, which has actually meant that the rudders were allowed to flap around. And that has also in turn damaged some of the structure within the tailplane. It's torn some of the formers in there because the control rods have been moving around beyond their what they're allowed to effectively. So tailplanes, they will most likely be done away at somewhere like Arco, which is Aircraft Restoration Company down at Duxford. And elevators, we actually have a spare set of elevators which we may well restore in the summer period ready for the winter. So as you can see as we go along, we're eventually getting to a majority of the aircraft being made airworthy. The next job is the wings. Now wings are going to be a hell of a job, terrible job. They will go on to the jigs that we borrowed from BBMF, and they will be completely de-riveted and re-riveted. One of the major, I would call it a flaw, I'll put my neck out there and call it a flaw on a Lancaster, is it uses plug rivets. Now plug rivets are basically, the structure has or the spar, shall we say, has a hole drilled in it. It's bottomed out, so it doesn't go all the way through the spar. It's partway into the spar, it's then tapped, so it has a thread tapped into it, and then you beat a rivet into it until it expands into the threads, which obviously stops it from coming out again. I'm sure it was a good idea at the time, but now coming to it, it's going to be a real bugbear for us. We came across them on the aileron, the port aileron, and we vowed never again. And they are basically the forward skins on top of the wings are plug riveted to the spar. The Canadians actually, when they built Mark 10 Lancasters, decided we won't use plug rivets, we'll just use screws. Now that's a brilliant idea. So we've actually managed, going back to ailerons, we've managed to find some Canadian ailerons which we can use the forged section out of with machine screws in them. So at the moment we're in discussion as to what we're going to do on the main planes with the use of either plug rivets or screws. So there may well be a modification going there to try and use screws as opposed to plug rivets. So we're going to do one winter on the starboard wing, one winter on the port wing. And so they'll come off the aircraft, obviously the engine will come off the aircraft onto the jig, de-riveted, new skins where required, complete structure cleaned down, repaint, re-riveted, and of course all the fuel tank bays need work as well. At the point when we take them apart, we will see into areas that we cannot currently see. You can see quite a lot of the main spar sections and the wing sections, the webs, from the fuel tank bays. So there's 3 fuel tanks on each side, one on the centre section, and then 2 in the main plane wing section. So we've had those covers off, we've had a look inside the wing. You can only, of course, see so far. So we may get some nasty surprises when we actually start to de-skin the wing. We may find damage to spars, corrosion on spars, all sorts of things. So we're currently working out and facilitating the production of main spars if required. The main spars on a Lancaster are actually lifed differently depending on which part of spar it is. So the lowest spar on the aircraft is the bottom rear boom. So best way to explain it, the Lancaster's got 4 booms in it making 2 spars, a top and a bottom at the front and the back, joined by a web. And they're all lifed to different hours. The lifing was put on by British Aerospace, deemed to be the life taken from Shackleton, basically. Shackleton has a very similar spar to a Lancaster. I think it's the same extrusion and a slightly beefed up material, so stronger material. So they looked at the Shackleton, and when the BBMF Lancaster became airworthy and was flying and doing lots of hours, they decided, actually looking at this, we've got to work out what the fatigue is on this material, and then set a fatigue meter on the BBMF Lancaster, dictating how many hours it's allowed to fly before the spar's replaced. So there was no original lifing put on the spars by Avro, and in fact the Canadians don't have a life on their spars, it's purely on inspection. BBMF have the lifing, I think it's about 4,500 hours on the bottom rear boom, and it gets more and more, so I think it's about 5,400 hours on the top front boom, I think. And again, as you go out into the wing sections, the lifing changes on the booms as well. So this Lancaster's done 2,424 flying hours in a total, and it's also, of course, taxied around for however many years, 20 years. So there is a certain fatigue that's already on the spars, and a certain fatigue, the CAA believe, that has been put on the spars by taxiing the aircraft. So we are kind of working worst case scenario. If we do need spar boom material, we better actually have the ability to make it if we need it. So in fact, we are talking to a group out in Canada who are in a similar situation as to how we get some spar material passed on modification and also produced or extruded. So that's the next 2 years. So year 8 and 9 is the wing section. And then year 10 is the big one. It's the centre section. So if we do have to replace spars, this is a big part of it. The centre section is a very big piece. If you look at the Lancaster, where the wing itself actually tips up, so that's the start of the outer main plane where it joins the centre section, and the centre section comes just rear of the rear spar and just forward of the forward spar. And that, we've left the spar work till the end. And people have said, why have you left the spar work to the end? Generally, when you restore an aircraft, you start with the heart of it and work out, which on a Lancaster would be the main spars, and work out. We're working to a 10-year plan, as you can see here. We don't know what's going to happen in year 9. You might find that insurance companies will no longer insure vintage aircraft. You might find the CAA turn around and say, we're no longer going to allow aircraft of that period, that vintage, to fly. You may find that you can no longer get avgas, which is a possibility. So we are not going to possibly invest the hugest bulk of money in replacing spars if in year 1, if in actual fact in year 10 we can turn around and we can't fly it. If there is any damage to the spars, they're still perfectly fine for taxiing, just not good for airworthy. So we're biding our time, spending what money we have, replacing rivets and things which will fall apart in the end, before taking that big gulp, that big bite, and possibly looking at replacing spars. So that's why the heart of the aircraft is the last bit to be done. What money we have, we want to spend on bettering the aircraft as a whole, rather than one section.